Fantastic. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Brown. I work here at the Institute, and I'm very glad that we can convene this panel. This is not the first panel that we've convened on the situation in Xinjiang, but the situation there has continued to deteriorate since the start of the year. I'm delighted that we have all of our panelists here today, many who have come from far away to be with us, to give some perspective. For the last 16 years, the Chinese Communist Party has been telling the Chinese people and the world at large that it is waging its own war on terrorism in the Uyghur homeland of Xinjiang, known to Uyghurs as East Turkestan. Xinjiang has since become the most heavily garrisoned and surveilled part of the People's Republic of China. As many as 1 million Uyghurs are detained in the Communist Party's political re-education camps, which have largely been built up since the start of the beginning of the year, where they have been subject in many cases to torture, medical maltreatment, and other forms of abuse. Meanwhile, the stability of the region has become essential for PRC's strategic One Belt, One Road initiative, and the Communist Party has used its influence around the world to stifle criticism of the human rights emergency in Xinjiang that it has created. What is at stake for the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang? How has the PRC's conduct and repression in Xinjiang affected its foreign relations, including with Pakistan, the countries of Central Asia, and the Middle East? What do we know about the policy debates among Chinese authorities and the people of China concerning Xinjiang, and what, if any, are the dissenting viewpoints? What does the PRC's conduct in Xinjiang tell us about the nature of the Communist Party's power, both at home, and the PRC's ambitions to transform itself into a world power? Delighted, as I said, to have a number of guests from afar. Michael Clark, anybody who has undertaken to learn something about Xinjiang will know his byline. He's developed a number of great essays and books and edited volumes over the years. Just recently, he has edited this new volume, Terrorism and Counterterrorism in China, which is an enormously timely book. It makes a major contribution to the academic study of both PRC's perceptions on terrorism and its tactics and its objectives, as well as the situation in Xinjiang and how this has affected PRC's conduct elsewhere around the world. Dr. Clark is, of course, an associate professor at the Australian National University, and we're delighted to have him. We also have two contributors to the book. Sean Roberts, who I'm delighted to welcome back. He's from the George Washington University, and Andrew Small, who's very much well known here in Washington, D.C., as a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I'm also delighted to have back Louisa Greevy, who is currently serving as the Director of External Affairs at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and Louisa has been studying and working on this issue for many, many years now. And I'm also delighted to have Rushan Abbas, who is a former journalist with Radio Free Asia, founder of the One Voice, One Step initiative, and is a prominent Uyghur American who will help us to understand a little bit of how this crisis in Xinjiang is affecting us here in the United States and Americans here in the United States. So with that, welcome, and we'll begin with Dr. Clark. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for the very kind introduction, and also for hosting the event today. I just wanted to begin by briefly giving the audience an overview regarding the rationale for the new book and the focus and the approaches to it, before then dipping briefly into my own contribution to this particular book. So the question that I posed when I initially developed a conference at my home institution at the National Security College at ANU was essentially this question of putting China's approach to terrorism and counter-terrorism essentially in comparative perspective. In much of the post 9/11 literature on terrorism and counter-terrorism, China was largely absent as a factor or as an actor of analysis. A major critique of major streams of counterterrorism, of course, waged by the United States and others around the world after 9/11, has essentially been about privileging national security in the name of counterterrorism over other particularly pressing issues, whether they be human rights or socioeconomic development. This, of course, has been amplified in the Chinese context, given that China's issues and concerns with respect to terrorism are primarily shaped by a number of core themes specifically related to Xinjiang or East Turkestan. One is the long history of Chinese attempts at the integration, modernisation of what has been a traditionally frontier region for China-based states. The second broad theme has been consistent claims by the Chinese government since 9/11 of linkages between Uyghur separatism and or terrorism with various forms of radical Islamism in Central Asia, Afghanistan and the Middle East. A third theme that shapes China's approach to terrorism and counter-terrorism, certainly in more recent years, is China's global presence and its growing footprint in a number of those core regions of the globe. So a core assumption of the approach in this book is that we need to look both domestically and internationally in terms of what are the drivers and motivations of China's approach to terrorism and counter-terrorism. In terms of the conceptual approach, I'd also note we draw in particular some inspiration from the critical terrorism studies literature. In particular, one particular stream that looks at the need to move away from an actor-based analysis of terrorism towards an action-based one. So here this suggests that terrorism is not the action of any particular type of group or of actors, but rather a method, strategy or tool that can be deployed by any actor. And this therefore opens up the space to move ourselves away or beyond the criticism that most terrorism studies literature privileges the state as a legitimate actor in this context. A second core conceptual approach derived from the critical terrorism studies literature is also an interpretivist approach, where we explore the discursive construction of terrorism and how such constructions shape our understandings of the phenomenon itself and those that perpetrate it. This is particularly important as it draws attention to the manner in which discursive constructions of terrorism serve to stifle domestic dissent and opposition and or accentuate, quote unquote, the barbarism of terrorists in order to normalise a recourse to extra-legal responses to them. This is particularly relevant in the Chinese context and informs my own particular contribution to this volume, where I explore the effects on China's foreign and domestic policy of its reframing of Uyghur separatism towards Uyghur terrorism, and in particular the framing of it as a transnational threat and the way in which this has affected China's approach. There are a number of phases in this development. In the pre-9/11 period, it's remarkable to note the way in which the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state consistently framed episodes of unrest in Xinjiang, for instance, during the 1990s, primarily as a splittist one, i.e. a separatist one, not as a terrorist threat in and of itself. This, of course, is entirely reframed after 9/11, and Sean has written much about this. Becomes definitively reframed by the party as Uyghur terrorism after 9/11. So here we have a widespread discourse, consistent discourse, since that point in time that paints episodes of unrest and violence in Xinjiang as the work of extremists with connections to so-called hostile external forces. This shift in narrative has had a number of important effects. Domestically, the reframing of Uyghur separatism as Uyghur terrorism has in fact served as a cognitive threat amplifier for the Chinese state, where we have key implications for Uyghur identity and also the conditions of socio-economic development in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region itself. In terms of China's war on terror itself, however, the most important trend here of the shift or reframing of the nature of the threat has been the development of the well-documented high-tech security state in the region and the focus on so-called de-extremification policies. And the most egregious example of which we've seen, of course, is the so-called re-education camps throughout Xinjiang. In terms of foreign policy, there's also been a number of important implications. I'll just note a couple because some of the other panelists will speak to some of these. The most important trend here, I think, relates specifically to China's diplomacy, security diplomacy in Central Asia and the wider Eurasian region. And particularly important here is the way in which the Uyghur terrorist narrative has been embedded in China's multilateral diplomacy in the region, particularly through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Here we have an organization that has embedded what has been termed a status multilateralism in the region, which is primarily about the protection of sovereignty, borders, and regime security, which very much reflects China's core interests vis-a-vis Xinjiang itself. And this has been expressed practically through the development of wider SCO counterterrorism cooperation in a variety of fields, including a counterterrorism convention signed in 2009. So, just to conclude before handing to Sean, I wrap up my contribution in this book by noting a number of core trends and outcomes as a result of this reframing of the Uyghur threat, in inverted commas, as a transnational one. It reflects very much the Chinese state's discursive framing of Uyghur identity as almost a latent threat in and of itself to the Chinese state and its interests in Xinjiang. We have a securitization very clearly of Uyghur ethnic identity as expressed in the re-education camps. More broadly, in speaking to this theme of what China's approach to counterterrorism tells us about the nature of the Chinese state, I think it suggests one particularly important issue, and that is the Chinese state under Xi Jinping increasingly blurs lines between what we might term in the West state security or regime security and national security, where the two become very much united in the party's perceptions. Sean.
Thank you. Sean.
All right. My chapter in the book focuses on the PRC's crafting of a narrative of Uyghur terrorism and looks at some of the impacts of that. In particular, I frame this narrative as being a self-fulfilling prophecy. And a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of public policy is when wrongful analysis leads to actions that actually make that analysis come true. So going back to right after September 11th, the Chinese government came out with several announcements, white papers, and so on, asserting that it faced a serious terrorist threat from Uyghurs. And in particular, these white papers outlined a situation where all of the Uyghur advocacy groups in diaspora were essentially part of this terrorist threat. And they were aligned with al-Qaeda, funded by al-Qaeda, and had been perpetrating terrorist attacks, planned terrorist attacks throughout the 1990s in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the XUAR. Looking at that assertion, we can see that throughout the 1990s, there were various incidents of violence in the XUAR. But analyzing all of them together, it's very difficult to characterize any of them as a terrorist attack, conclusively at least. There's some that could have been terrorist attacks, but even if that was the case, there was no claiming of them as being terrorist attacks, and no organization that could be seen as perpetrating them. Also, I want to point out that the definition I'm using for terrorism in this context is an attack that's deliberately carried out against civilians, is premeditated, and has political purposes. Much of the chapter, however, focuses on how this narrative that the PRC created early on after September 11th spread over time. In particular, they focused on a group called the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, which was little known at the time, or virtually unknown at the time. And it was successful in not only continuing to assert this narrative inside China, but also to spread it internationally. So you had political scientists and terrorism experts repeat much of this narrative. and plug in the Chinese example in comparative studies of terrorism. And I think this was very problematic and led to a normalization of the idea that there was a serious Uyghur terrorist threat in China. Also, as part of that, both the US and the UN recognized ETIM as a terrorist organization, put them on terrorism watch lists, and that had further implications that were essentially reinforcing China's approach to Uyghurs as a terrorist threat. ETIM still creeps into the news. People still talk about ETIM, including the Chinese government, and they frame all of the terrorist threat that they face as coming from this organization. However, in my own research, I try to unpack what is this group and whether they did exist or still exist. And I found that they did exist in the late 1990s into 2001 when the U.S. attacked Afghanistan. At that time, there were a very small organization that was trying to train Uyghurs in Afghanistan to start an insurgency within China. By all accounts, it seems that they were not successful. They maybe had a dozen or so people come through these training camps. There's no evidence that any of these people ever went back and perpetrated any kind of violence inside the ex-UAR. And the leader of ETIM, Hassan Massoum, was killed in 2003 in Pakistan. And with that, essentially, this organization ceased to exist in 2003. And we don't really hear much about any kind of organized Uyghur militant group until 2005, when we start to see YouTube videos coming out of a group called the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP. And a lot of the studies subsequently have conflated these two groups. There is some connection, but essentially they're very different organizations. ETIM never was able to establish a constructive relationship with Al-Qaeda, which felt that they were just focused on China and not interested in global jihad. TIP was actually an organization which maybe only had, for a long time, one person in it. And it was somebody who had been associated with ETIM. His name is Abdul Haq. And he was the one person in these YouTube videos. And we saw YouTube videos going to the Beijing Olympics showing explosions in China and threatening that there was going to be Uyghur terrorist attacks during the Olympics, which there were not, of course. And my analysis, I mean, we don't have a lot of information about this group, but my analysis suggests that it was likely a shell organization connected to Al-Qaeda that was trying to recruit Uyghurs to Al-Qaeda. And that was basically what this organization was through until about 2013. And then in 2013, we find this organization in Syria actually perpetrating violence, not necessarily terrorism, but actually fighting more of a conventional war in Syria. And the group reemerges as an actual army. But the interesting part about that is a lot of the reason that they became a real army is that through the repression related to counterterrorism policies in the ex-UAR throughout the 2000s, we started to see a mass exodus of Uyghurs out of China, particularly after 2009 and the unrest in Urumqi. And there were human trafficking networks bringing Uyghurs through Southeast Asia. And through that network, there were people who became recruited to TIP in Syria. And most of them were recruited in Turkey, and there's even some question about whether Turkey has facilitated the movement of some of these Uyghurs there, because they're fighting in the same area that Turkish groups are also fighting. So my general point about trying to unpack this narrative is that we see in 2001, there's no viable Uyghur violent insurgency within the XUAR. There is dissent. Surely many Uyghurs have separatist aspirations, but there's no organized insurgency, no organized group that's going to push that within China. By the present day, now you have an actual army of Uyghurs who have been trained. And I've spoke to several of the Uyghurs who fought in Syria and then have come out to Turkey. And they all explain that their whole goal is to be able to fight a war against China. Now, it's very unlikely that they would be able to get back into China, particularly now, given the situation in the XUAR and the tight security. But as Michael pointed out, there's a lot of linkages to what's happening in the XUAR and the Belt and Road Initiative, and China has a lot of interests outside in Central Asia and South Asia, where returning fighters could actually have impact. So that's what I'll say right now. I'd be glad to hear questions, and I encourage everybody to try to get a copy of the book and read the whole argument.
Andrew.
Right, thanks, Eric, and thanks for the chance to join this panel and the essay collection. So clearly, China's overwhelming focus on counterterrorism remains internal and on Xinjiang itself, but my remarks are going to focus on the foreign policy dimensions of some of what China is up to. The argument that the book chapter makes is basically that China's approach to terrorism has been conditioned by its geography and by its partners. And in the last few years, particularly as a result of the conflict in Syria, we've seen probably the biggest set of changes in that regard since the late 1990s. For the better part of 2 decades, Afghanistan and Pakistan essentially provided the main focal points for China in this regard. The group, debatably known as ETIM, clearly did have camps in Taliban-run Afghanistan, and after the US invasion, Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas provided the base for whatever remnants of the group were there, which subsequently emerged, as Sean talked about, as the Turkestan Islamic Party. And it was in Pakistan and Afghanistan more generally, beyond the TIP-ETIM question, where the most capable transnational groups and militant organizations were largely based. And the big advantage that China had in this regard was the special role played by its closest security partner, Pakistan. And there were a few unstated principles that I think guided Chinese government policy across this period of time through the 2000s, the late 90s. First of all, was that China should make sure that it doesn't become a top-tier target for any of the principal groups operating in the region, whether that's outright terrorist organizations, militant groups, or their sympathizers or supporters, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Kashmiri groups, and so on. That China can and should reach deals with these groups over Xinjiang and over their backing to any of the groups that do target China. That China shouldn't take direct action itself against any of these broader groups, and it should be careful about its positioning and cooperation with anyone that does. And that counterterrorism policy, generally speaking, should be almost entirely Uyghur-focused. The message to almost everyone else was, we don't have to be enemies as long as you leave us alone yourselves and you don't back our enemies. We won't support you, but we'll only do the bare minimum against you. And for the most part, it has to be said that in some important ways, China's approach worked. A deal was reached with the Taliban over the status of ETIM and attacks from Afghan territory. Osama bin Laden's very few statements about China were remarkably conciliatory sounding if you go back and look at them. And TIP, insofar as I would agree operated in an extremely modest way, functioned under incredibly restricted conditions in North Waziristan. And this is partly because the local and global priorities for a number of these other groups didn't include China, and the Uyghur cause itself was often relatively marginal for them. But the other element of this was Pakistan. Across this entire period of time, the state that was at the center of many of the region's militant networks consistently sought to ensure that its all-weather friend, China, did not become a priority target for any of these groups. It used its influence to broker relationships, to dissuade these groups from concerning themselves with China, and it took direct action in a number of cases where necessary, including killing Hassan Massoum in South Waziristan in 2003. Groups operating in the region knew that if they targeted China, they risked becoming a target for Pakistan too. So weakened was ETIM in the early to mid-2000s that at precisely the moment where China was winning these designations at the UN and from the United States, you had very serious questions, as Sean suggested, about whether the group meaningfully existed at all. The numbers, whether it was one or whether it was a little bit more than that, nonetheless, it was extremely small. They were dependent on larger, more capable groups, such as the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and they had very little autonomous space in which to act. Even later on, when they were able to generate propaganda materials from around 2008, maybe a little earlier, the capacity to launch attacks in China or on Chinese targets anywhere else was extremely limited, and there's very little evidence of their role in any of the attacks on the Chinese mainland. These conditions have all now significantly shifted. In South Asia, Pakistan's capacity to control militancy in its neighborhood, particularly since the rise of the TTP, has been eroded. Pakistan itself is no longer the home of TIP. Since the Pakistani Army's Zarb-e-Azab operation, which displaced the small TIP presence in Fatah, it now means that after 15 years of operating in Pakistan, the group's leadership, at least, is now centered, it appears, in Afghanistan again. But as Sean mentioned, the principal theater for the TIP has also moved. The largest number of fighters are in Syria, operating with what, in its latest evolution, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And it's not just the numbers that are important here. We can debate how many people there actually are there. As Sean noted, TIP in Syria has emerged as a more capable and serious group than it ever was in Pakistan. It's been involved in major campaigns, better trained, more sophisticated tactics, more credibility among the wider jihadi network, and so on. And beyond the TIP itself, the rise of Islamic State introduced a major actor to the network of global militant organizations that had fewer qualms than Al-Qaeda historically did about making China an explicit target, producing Uyghur and Mandarin language propaganda material and so on. And although there are more Uyghurs with Nusra Front than with IS, the group's reach poses a different set of problems for Chinese security, exemplified by the fact that it's even attracted a small number of Hui recruits as well. More immediately, there are serious worries in Beijing about returnees to the region, and by the region I largely mean Asia, not necessarily to China itself, and all the more so with the looming showdown in Idlib and the rise of IS in Afghanistan. And the Syria conflict has reconditioned the recruitment pathways. With improvements in security on China's borders in South and Central Asia, the main transit routes for Uyghurs fleeing repression in Xinjiang since 2009 were through Southeast Asia and Turkey, and I think there's little doubt that there was active Turkish government support for that, at least for a period of time. And without going into the Southeast Asian developments, I would note that the Chinese kind of externally focused counterterrorism hands, who used to be primarily focused on Central Asia and South Asia, are now spending substantially more of their time on the Middle East and South Asia too. What does this translate into? Broadly speaking, I think we see more of an understanding on China's part that it has to take on a more direct role on counterterrorism issues, that it can't entirely outsource or hide behind others, and then it has to look at some of the broader conditions in which threats exist, rather than being able to maintain this very narrow focus that it used to have, which is, in other words, a weakening of each of the unstated principles that I mentioned earlier in my remarks. The main Chinese effort in this regard is still going to be political, intelligence, diplomatic. They're having to work much more seriously with a wider array of countries and subnational groups, whether it's Southeast Asian intelligence chiefs on extraditions, attempting to broker reconciliation talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan, dealing with Iraqi tribal leaders on hostage negotiations with ISIS, and a number of other cases that we can go into. In this respect, though, China is in a weaker position. It needs more help than when one largely trusted partner, Pakistan, could handle most of these issues for them. In Afghanistan, I would even note that this now means a more active enthusiasm than was ever the case before about a long-term US military presence for counterterrorism purposes. On the military and security side, the anti-terrorism law has opened the door for Chinese security forces to operate in counterterrorism missions overseas. And since that law was passed, we've already seen armed Chinese patrols in Badakhshan, which were explicitly tied to counterterrorism. And this is also the location where China is financing the construction of an Afghan military base. We also saw what, to me, was an extraordinary debate in China about whether it should be militarily involved in Syria for counterterrorism purposes. And I wouldn't be surprised if the political and logistical circumstances permit it, that we'll see if we saw a serious overseas Chinese counterterrorism mission at some point. And it's quite clear that the PLA's interest in overseas counterterrorism missions has objectives that go well beyond counterterrorism itself. I also wouldn't be surprised if we saw elements of the Xinjiang AI facial recognition monitoring model encouraged and picked up by various other friendly repressive countries at some point. And with more immediate practical impact, all of these developments have, of course, translated into the drive for greater pressure on overseas Uyghur communities and pressure on extraditions. The final point I'd make, though, is this greater international activism on China's part on counterterrorism shouldn't necessarily be seen as reflecting greater strength on China's part. This is an area where China's capabilities, its networks, its analytical capacity, and so on are actually very weak. Its vulnerabilities around the world are in lots of respects growing, and it's more reliant on other parties than the parties that couldn't be described as friends or partners in this area than it ever was before. And in the context of the other serious issues that the speakers who I think we're going to hear from in the next round of remarks will be raising, I would suggest that this leverage, which I think it is leverage that others have, should be borne in mind when we're collectively figuring out how to deal with China on some of these other serious domestic issues that are taking place in Xinjiang.
Thank you. Louisa.
Yes, thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for organizing. I'd like to make a couple of points on the turning points in this narrative of terrorism and counterterrorism. I think Michael is exactly right that among the three evil forces that the Chinese state claims to be facing as a security threat, separatism, terrorism, and extremism, in fact, the emphasis has moved very decisively from a strong emphasis on separatism as a threat to terrorism, and actually right now, just in the last year, it's actually an extremism threat more than a terrorism threat. It's a de-extremification campaign and not a counterterrorism campaign. But I do want to problematize a little bit the starting point, which is taking for granted that China's threat used to be separatism, but now we have to watch and carefully parse the government's definition of terrorism, because did it face a separatism threat? If so, it was a thought crime, as Sean points out. So all three of those terms need to be viewed with equal skepticism without simply assuming there used to be a separatist threat, but then we can say that the terrorism threat was less strong. And secondly, the theme of the securitization of Uyghur ethnic identity. Extremely important point. What is the timeline for that? It's true that, as Sean points out, the government turned on a dime within, I think, it's well laid out in the argument in the book chapter, just about 7 weeks after the 9/11 attack, suddenly the white paper appears connecting a Uyghur threat, however defined, with international radical actors. That has nothing to do with the securitization of Uyghur ethnic identity. In fact, the campaign, of course, predates not only the first occurrence of what Sean would define as arguably the first potentially terrorist attack, which is not until 2014. It also predates this announcement in 2001 after 9/11. I will quote to you the renowned Xinjiang expert Frederick Starr, noting in congressional testimony in 2005, 13 years ago, there has been a sustained strike hard maximum pressure campaign, Yenda, in the XUAR since the late 1990s. And this campaign has been focusing on the Uyghur threat. I'll give you another statistic. In 2006, 18,000 Uyghurs were arrested for so-called security threats. And now we come to the turning point. What is happening now since April 2017 or since August 2014 with the appointment of Chen Quanguo as the party secretary in Xinjiang? So these shocking policies, which horrify everyone who looks at them, can truly by no stretch of the imagination be considered a legitimate response to any concerns about civilian security, violent threats. And I'll just mention some features of this campaign, quite apart from the horrifying numbers of people being rounded up. If there are 1 million people in the camps and 2 million additional people who are spending their days and sometimes their evenings in so-called daytime political indoctrination classes, coming home only to sleep, this has been documented by the Chinese Human Rights Defenders Network just in August, based on triangulating a lot of sources. The campaign goes much further in terms of securitizing Uyghur identity itself, and this goes from language, campaigns going back 14 years and longer to delegitimize the use of the language, to take away the ability of children to speak and even become literate in their own language, with the abolition of the use of Uyghur language, of course, in violation of China's own autonomy laws, first in universities and then starting in 2004, already quite a long time ago, in elementary schools, and then even a push into the nurseries. Basically, from babyhood, children who go to daycare will not hear Uyghur. That's language, and our organization has issued 2 in-depth reports on that. Then the promotion of intermarriage, which has gotten a little bit of attention. This has been mostly an initiative, as far as we can tell, from some local governments in Xinjiang, a couple of counties offering on their own initiative 10,000 yuan per year for any family that's interracial, none for same race in Xinjiang. And then finally, we have new reports about another stage of life and death and the transmission of cultural identity, which is death and burial. So we know just in April this year, authorities in Hudson set up a surprising number of new cremation centers. They called them burial management centers, certainly part of what the Chinese state has said throughout the country as part of modernizing or sinicizing religion. But these centers, supposedly, which opened in July 2017, the reason given by one official contacted by Radio Free Asia were, it's part of the 4 orders that we implement here in local government in Xinjiang. And what are the 4 orders? Promotion of Chinese-style religion, so sinicization of religion, encouraging residents to self-report and criticize their own behavior, opposing religious extremism, and expressing gratitude to the Communist Party. So opening these cremation centers was not, like in other parts of the country, to save valuable urban land. It really was part of the campaign to ensure, to remake the culture of the region. So at the very least, the policy of forcing Uyghurs to cremate their dead instead of burying them is an attempt to wipe away another distinctive marker of Uyghur culture. As one Uyghur analyst put it, controlling burial prevents Uyghur religious figures from preaching on the meaning of life and death, heaven and hell, and thereby controls every aspect of Uyghur life from birth to death. And some have speculated about an even more sinister purpose for such cremation centers. And finally, family separation. I commend Sigal Samuel's report just released yesterday in The Atlantic under a very dramatic headline that really tells the whole story, and I know Rishan will be talking about this. Sigal Samuel saying, China's jaw-dropping family separation policy, children and parents are being ripped apart on a massive scale. It may rob an entire generation of their Muslim identities. This is certainly what happens when parents are taken away into these indefinite detention camps and the children are left. Are they sent to orphanages? Many are not even allowed to stay with grandparents, but are taken by the state. Overall, this gives a picture of a policy that is not focused on militancy, but is rather focused on identity. So it's now reasonable to ask, where will this lead? We don't have any evidence about, and no documentation about, state policy intentions. What is the end game of the camps and the rest of these policies? But think through the practical choices facing both the local and national governments in China now that they have these people in camps. If you had broken up families, arrested hundreds, possibly thousands of intellectuals and business leaders and entertainment figures, sports stars, taken children away from their parents, brutalized hundreds of thousands of young men, and been responsible for the death in custody of many people, young and old. We have friends whose parents have already been known to die in these camps. What happens next? Do you allow them to go back home? Do you release them? However, many of them are, still in health after several years of this punishing political indoctrination campaign, so-called. So if the state was concerned by threats to stability in Xinjiang while building Belt and Road, while being concerned about the resurgence of religious identity and potentially radical identity, if that was the stated concern, what happens now that an entire generation, actually all generations in Xinjiang, now have every single family has been given more profound and more recent reasons for profound grievances against the state? So it's very hard to imagine a scenario under which this government can ever let these people out of these camps. So this is really the next level, Sean, in terms of the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not whether we have a band of several hundred or hundreds of people who have been training somehow in hopes of some kind of insurgency. Rather, the government's policies have leapfrogged into a direct war upon an entire people. So this profoundly traumatized ethnic group with a strong identity, despite these long-standing assimilation policies, is now effectively in the 24-hour custody of the state. Altogether, there are 11 million, according to Chinese statistics. What can it do with them? So as horrified as we are in trying to grapple with these numbers, many places 1 out of 10, some places 1 out of 6 adults are in a camp. Businesses are shuttered, children are taken away. But it's not going to be the end of the story. So this is another turning point. We're trying to acknowledge where we are now, but what if today's crimes are actually precursors of even graver crimes in the future? So the policy implications are really very clear. It cannot be business as usual. Our own American pension funds should not be making profits from the companies that are selling the security equipment that's facilitating this ethnic suppression with the iris scans and all the rest. That includes Huawei, Hikvision, Thermo Fisher Scientific, and others. The officials responsible cannot be dealt with as ordinary government officials in our diplomacy. Their American sanction policy absolutely should be applied. And for academics and researchers, is it business as usual to be working with colleagues in China who may have nothing to do with the policy, to the repression in China? Or is it the fact that simply in order conduct joint research, to exchange, to maintain friendships and collegial relations, nonetheless, you must remain silent on this horrific situation in Xinjiang, where the largest number of people ever held in an ethnic containment is happening right now in Xinjiang? Is silence the price to pay for business as usual? Nobody can say, we didn't know. So business as usual is a moral abdication for which no excuse can now be found.
Thanks. Rushan.
Thank you, Eric. You have shown true leadership in Washington in bringing attention to these issues. I'd like to thank the audience for being here today. My name is Rushan Abbas, and I'm not a scholar, but as an Uyghur expat, I have been watching what speakers are describing here today. These days, we hear a lot about Chinese tariffs, but very little about the number, 1 million. 1 million is more than the entire population of Washington, D.C., and it's the number of innocent Uyghur people who have been forced into Chinese internment camps today. There are over 1 million innocent Uyghur people who are in the concentration camps today. As the US Commission on China stated, this is the largest mass incarceration of an ethnic group in the world today. China calls the camps vocational training centers, but according to witnesses and the news accounts, vocational training means armed guards barbed wire, overcrowded rooms, malnutrition, dehydration, poor sanitation. It means being uprooted from home and family. It means stamping out of culture, identity, and religion. It means forced indoctrination. It means mental and physical abuse. It sounds like I'm describing concentration camps here, doesn't it? Since Mao's occupation of East Turkestan in 1949, the government has tried relentlessly to destroy Uyghur culture and religion. Uyghurs have been persecuted under the label of nationalists, counter-revolutionaries, and the separatists. Following 9/11 tragedy, communist authorities rebranded the effort as a war on terrorism. Today, the entire people of East Turkestan have become the victims of Xi Jinping's signature project, One Belt, One Road initiative. The entire region is branded. Punishment is cultural and collective. Over 1 million people in detention are charged with no crimes. Counties, districts, and the neighborhoods are filling quotas. China has characterized all political resistance as Islamic terrorism, and on that pretext developed a surveillance state built on DNA collection, ubiquitous cameras, facial recognition software, and GPS tracking systems on the vehicles. China has sent to internment camps Dr. Raila Dawood, an international renowned scholar studied in the US, Ablajan Aout Ayub, a pop star, Irfan Hazim, a professional soccer player, University Presidents Tashbulat Tiyip and Halmurat Hopur. China also sent Muhammad Salah Hajim, a famous scholar who translated Quran from Arabic to Uyghur, and which was done per Chinese government's permission. He was 82 years old and died in the camp. But this isn't happening simply to famous people or the expats. It's happening to my family. My in-laws from Khotan, 69 and 71 years old, farmer and housewife, and the 3 of their daughters, and a daughter-in-law. They're all housewives raising children, and their husbands, all farmers, all disappeared since April 2017. My husband and I have not been able to find whereabouts of my in-laws, the entire family. We fear that they all were taken to those internment camps, and we have no idea where my husband's 14 nieces and the nephews today, aged between 3 to 22 years old. We fear that many of them were sent to orphanages in inner China. We also heard Abdrim Idris, my brother-in-law, was sentenced 20 years in jail. Dilnur Enver, a mother of 3, came to Istanbul in 2016 with her daughter to study for her master's degree. 2 young children, 5 and 7 years old, they were left with their grandparents in Kashgar. In April 2017, her children were taken from their grandparents. As of today, she doesn't know the whereabouts of her children. Mahmutjan Erkin, a former teacher in East Turkestan, was contacted Chinese police shortly after his arrival in Turkey in 2016. They asked him to spy on the Uyghurs in Turkey and write articles praising the communist state, promised money and a fancy house in Istanbul in return. When he refused, the police threatened to refer him to internet as a terrorist.
Is that Interpol?
I'm sorry, Interpol. Sorry. When he refused, they threatened to refer him to Interpol as a terrorist. Mamutjan went public to expose this. There are a million stories like this, and more disturbing news reports too. Radio Free Asia reports government is constructing massive crematorias in mostly Uyghur populated areas throughout the region, as Luisha just mentioned earlier. It is a warning sign, but so far, the world isn't watching. We plead to the world leaders, politicians, NGOs, and the civil societies to be one voice against the communist China's cruelty and to take a step together to end this mass atrocity of today's era. Act now before it's too late. Thank you.
I have some questions, but would like to begin by opening it up to the wider audience. I know many of you have, sir, in the front row here. Yeah, the mic will come. Thank you. If you could quickly identify yourself.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I went to Kazakhstan late last year, and one little known fact is that perhaps 10% of these people that are being arrested and incarcerated are Kazakhs. Maybe more, but no more than 20. In Kazakhstan, this is fairly well known, and the people on the street are outraged. It's as if China took its biggest gun and shot its foot off. And I think this is perhaps how we solve this problem. Because the Kazakh man on the street is saying, not 1 inch on Belton Road until this ends. And it's other Central Asians feeling the same way, because this comes across as not anti-Uyghur, but as anti-Islam. And collectively, the Central Asian republics, if they stood up against this, I think could be profoundly effective. Do you guys agree with that, disagree with that? You think that's a potential pressure point? What can we do to encourage that?
Sean?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. One of the Central Asian states have been very quiet about the Uyghur problem historically. I call it the Uyghur problem in terms of what's happening to Uyghurs in China. They're aware of it. People on the street are aware of it. I do think it's a turning point what's happening to Kazakhs in many respects. I mean, one respect is the Chinese government long kind of created a wedge between Uyghurs and Kazakhs within China. And I was very surprised to see Kazakhs start to get interned in these camps. And that is only maybe bringing Kazakhs and Uyghurs closer together. Now, of course, President Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan has so much invested in the relationship with China, but I do feel that his biggest blind spot are Kazakh nationalists, because he's an old Communist Party boss. He kind of learned Kazakh as he was president, and he now he's quite good Kazakh speaker, but he wasn't when he in 1990. And so he's always been a bit worried about the Kazakh nationalists. And the people who are being interned are all relatives, and including some of them actually who are Kazakh citizens, but they're at least relatives of a group called the Oroman, who are Kazakh immigrants from China to Kazakhstan. And that was an initiative of Nazarbayev early on in the 90s to increase the Kazakh ethnic population of Kazakhstan. And so that group of people is very activated. I mean, I think it's the same I've seen with a lot of Uyghurs who previously were not political Uyghurs who are abroad. They've told me, for a long time I was trying to be quiet about this. I didn't want to have any ramifications for my families. But now people are saying, well, it doesn't matter. So we might as well be vocal about this. And the Orolman in Kazakhstan have become vocal about it. They have an organization that's trying to spread information about it. And I think that's putting, I think it's a good thing that it's putting Nazarbayev between a rock and a hard place. Now, I'm a little bit less optimistic about whether there's going to be serious pushback, but I hope so. And I think Kazakhstan would be the country that has the leverage. The other ones less so, but Kazakhstan has some serious leverage with China, so they certainly could find ways to push back.
One thing that we're seeing is that in a number of countries where populations are beginning to hear about what's happening in Xinjiang is that there is growing frustration and anger and pressure on governments to say something to Beijing. And yet at the same time, the money that BRI is offering to a lot of Belt and Road countries is revealing just how venal a lot of these governments are. Erdogan of Turkey, I think, had a brief moment of real moral clarity in 2009 when he observed back then that the Uyghurs were facing cultural genocide. I think he understood intuitively that there was something, that it was not simply a Chinese war on terrorism, but rather increasingly a war on Uyghur culture and Islam as such. And for a long time, as you know, the Turkish Republic had provided safe haven for civil resistance to the destruction that's been going on in Xinjiang. In recent years, however, Erdogan has completely stopped calling attention to what's been happening. He himself has backed his country into a strategic and an economic situation where he desperately, I believe, needs BRI funding to maintain his government at home and is angling for it. And as a consequence, we're seeing an enormous amount of pressure in the Uyghur diaspora in Turkey today. If this is able to consummate itself, it will be obviously extremely devastating for the Uyghurs. But in addition to that, it's a prelude to a new restructuring of power across Eurasia. Don't discount we can't discount the venality of the ruling regimes around the world and just how attractive some of this money is from the Belt and Road Initiative. It does have quite a bit of influence. I guess I do have one question for Dr. Clark and some of the contributors to the volume. I mean, you've looked at the historical evolution of the securitization strategy. Do you agree with the characterization that this has in fact become not just a war on terrorism, but as Sean had pointed out shortly after 9/11, I'd say, that it has produced a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy and has increasingly become a Chinese Communist Party war on Uyghur culture as such, a war on the thought crime of being different?
I'll jump in on that one first. I mean, I would absolutely agree with all of that, except to note a couple of important points, I think, that haven't been touched upon just yet. I mean, the issue of the self-fulfilling prophecy, and Louisa mentioned this as well towards the end of her remarks, I think is absolutely spot on. Yet at the same time as we're willing to criticize and should criticize the Chinese government, and in particular the Chinese Communist Party here, I think we all have to realize as well this type of mass-level campaign will have unintended consequences, and we've already seen some of that already. So Louisa also mentioned the development of local government or local individual officials' own initiatives. So they've been given essentially a top-down authority to conduct these types of campaigns, which basically gives them an open slather to implement them. And if they don't implement them, then they will be either punished or disciplined in various ways. So these types of campaigns always have unintended consequences like this, and feeds into a sort of, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also sort of a self-perpetuation of the process, which leads me to think anyway that there is no good outcome here. in terms of Louise's remark at the end about, what does the party state actually do now with these potentially millions of people that it is repressing? One way of thinking about this as well is the way in which the party state frames the so-called re-education centres. Ostensibly, the goal is transformation through re-education, which harks back, of course, to some of the Maoist era thought rectification campaigns all the way back to the Yan'an period pre the establishment of the PRC. Yet what's, I think, particularly disturbing about this is the alignment of some of those continuities with the Maoist mass line campaigns with 21st century technological developments. So the development of the high-tech security state dominated by high levels of surveillance, and also essentially the Chinese state's mining of personal data and that it collects through various measures, and using this as a form of so-called predictive policing to intern vast numbers of people.
Yeah. And I would go on to say that, well, I guess I'll make 2 points. One in terms of Islam. I think that what's interesting about what's happening in China is it's reflective of, I think, trends around the world where the war on terror has, in a lot of places, started to look more like a war on Islam. A lot of Muslims early on felt that that was an issue. I think that actually, in many ways, the Bush administration tried to really separate that, and I think also the Obama administration really did. I think to a certain degree, the Trump administration ran on an idea that Islam is part of the problem. We've seen that among a lot of popular pundits, not only in the US, but in Europe. But in China, we're really seeing it play out. So it's been interesting to watch, as I mentioned, that adding Kazakhs to these re-education centers really started to signal an issue about Islam. And we're starting to see it influence, to a certain degree, the Hui population too. And so there's a sense that isn't Islam the problem? And it's certainly evident in the policies that have been undertaken in the last several years in China, where the goal seems to be to strip Uyghurs of religion because they feel that that's at the core of it. The other point I'd like to make about the one thing, adding to Michael's point about the things happening now in Xinjiang looking very much like the Cultural Revolution and previous Maoist campaigns, I think is true. And it also looks a lot like some of the things Stalin implemented in the Soviet Union. But the really concerning thing about it is that this is really focused on specific ethnic groups. I think in a lot of countries that have experienced mass repression, people have been able to get over it because everybody experienced it. I can't see this having a positive outcome because it's so obviously targeting one group. And how is that group ever going to, look at inclusion in the state as being something that they can deal with?
Yeah, I just reinforce that the Hui point as well, because I think that is the interesting additional subcurrent that you've seen in the last few years, and I think particularly since Kunming. I mean, I think you had a conception in China that this was a Xinjiang question and a Uyghur question. I think you've particularly seen since 2014, in addition to all the things that one has to watch in Xinjiang, a view that says some of the techniques and approaches that we had previously essentially restricted to Xinjiang should be applied in other locations as well. And Xiadian, of course, in Yunnan was kind of one of the reference points for this that you've already seen in the last few years. And of course, it's not taking place in the same way way or on the same scale or of in the same nature as what's happening to the Uyghur population in China, but it is morphing into this broader Islam question rather than just an ethnic Uyghur question. And I think this is the other thing to kind of have an additional eye on across China as a whole in terms of how some of these things are rolled out, particularly since some of the capabilities that have been deployed in Xinjiang that Michael referenced are also accessible and can also be deployed elsewhere in the country.
Louisa?
Just one point, Tibetans. Also, many of the techniques that Chen Chengguo brought into Xinjiang had been implemented in Tibet. So it's not only Islam, certainly it's ethnic.
Right. Mike?
Yeah, just wanted to jump in and add on to Sean's point here in terms of we're thinking about this sort of a real change in terms of how we think about previous mass campaigns and how this relates to previous historical examples of this kind of thing. Is that the real red flag, I think, should be some of the concerning rhetoric by party officials that has leaked out, framing Uyghur identity and religion in particular as a tumour or a pathology to be eradicated. I think this speaks volumes about the intent behind this program.
Sir. Michael Davis, and I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center across the street. As Louisa pointed out, the guy in charge of Xinjiang now learned his craft in Tibet. That's where he was in charge earlier and was using these kinds of policies. Just wondering if people in the panel here have any thoughts on what does this mean for Tibet? Does it mean there's less pressure on Tibet? They're focusing on Muslims now and Tibetans are less threatening. I know that Sandom Rinpoche, one of the Tibetan leaders, was recently invited to China. And I know there's initiatives by the Tibetan exiles, the so-called 550 initiative, a big meeting that was just held in India about trying to reach out to China. So I'm just wondering, is there any thoughts on the panel about how this connects up with Tibet, which of course has been the other major challenge for China on its border regions? I spoke with some people in India, northern India, not too long ago from the Tibetan exile community, and they clearly stated that pressure has not been alleviated on them in the least. Tibet is also very much a garrison state within the context of the People's Republic of China. And I mean, what they build up there is a police state with real infrastructure and real power behind it. And of course, there's very little opposition and very little support for the Tibetan people as well right now. Yeah.
I will make a point on the religious dimension. I think the Chinese government for a long time in Xinjiang tried to control Islam. They tried to have the concept of a legal religious practice and legal religious practice. You had imams who were authorized by the state, and I think they found it didn't work. I think the Chinese government still believes that it can control Tibetan Buddhism, particularly as they're thinking about trying to control the succession process for the Dalai Lama. So it's interesting. That's one dimension. The other dimension is Tibetan Buddhism is very popular in the Chinese elite. So there isn't the same attempt, I think, to eradicate Tibetan Buddhism. They want to control it. They certainly want to control Tibetans, but it's a very different dimension in Xinjiang with the basic attempt to obliterate religion completely.
Something that Andrew had observed about one of the likely future trends, and we're in fact already seeing it, and I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit, that we're beginning to see the export by PRC of the AI-based sort of police surveillance technologies which have enabled this situation in Xinjiang. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, that whole structure and that capability is of interest to a lot of countries around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've had some kind of limited cases in which in which this has been applied in practice. I think Zimbabwe is one of the cases. Some of this was being rolled out before in a different way as well, the kind of safe cities and initiative and these sorts of things. But I mean, of course, it's appealing to various governments to have the kind of deployment of capabilities that the Chinese state has. And again, this isn't just restricted to autocracies. I mean, I think this is this kind of surveillance capability. China was notably ahead of virtually anyone else on facial recognition and some of these sorts of capacities. But when this is also coming along with security partnerships, with financing, with IT infrastructure, with a whole kind of package that is on offer under the auspices of the Digital Silk Road and some of these sorts of things, I think how far it's been rolled out so far, I mean, in some of the instances, of course, the Chinese companies themselves also want access to the data, and part of the additional value on the Chinese side and an additional reason for being proactive about it, aside from the kind of help provided to repressive capacities, is a broader data pool for facial recognition purposes. And so there's a kind of proactive effort to push some of these things out in certain places. But it's certainly something that I would expect to see popping up in more and more in a BRI context, even than we've already seen so far.
So just to add on to Andrew's point there, it's not also just the export of the technology, but it's also, I think, potentially the export of the technique or the strategy behind the technology. So Xi Jinping has openly spoken about recently that China should seek to export the system of quote-unquote social management and social credit to the Arab world, for instance. So there's very clear lines here emerging.
Yeah. Sir, here in the second row.
Thank you very much. My name is Jake Castle, and I'm an undergraduate student at American University. And so I know that as the Syrian government continues its advance in Syria, more of the families of militants of Chinese descent are being captured by refugee organizations or by the Syrian government. And so my question is, what reintegration process or perceived threat does China have to the families of these militants?
Yeah, if you have
Sure. I mean, I think it's what's happened globally when the U.S. captured several people that they thought might be terrorists who were Uyghurs in Afghanistan, or actually in Pakistan, shortly after 2001. And then once they realized they weren't a threat, they didn't want to send them back to China because their fate in China would be very dire indeed. And so they found other places to send them. Now, the Syrian government, they are less likely to worry about that. I imagine the Syrian government would send them back to China. Refugee organizations, however, I don't know what they might do. I mean, Turkey is where a lot of the former fighters from Syria have returned. They may send them back there as well. But I imagine there'll be a big push from the Chinese government to have them sent back to China.
Omar Kanat from Uyghur Human Rights Project. Thank you very much. So I have a question for Michael. So you used the term of Uyghur terrorism in your book and also in your statement today. It's not unjust to use this term because of some isolated incidents, in East Turkestan, and it's not very clear whether they were really terrorist attacks or not, because your term gave an impression to the people that there is a widespread terrorist activities in East Turkestan, and in reality there is not. And what's going on today in East Turkestan also doesn't have anything to do with the fight against terrorism or extremism or radicalism. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that comment. I suppose I should have been a little bit more detailed in my use of the term. As Sean mentioned as well, there are a number of contributions to the book that problematise this very issue. Sean's is one of them. Raffaello Pantucci's chapter as well also looks explicitly at alleged Uyghur connections with Al-Qaeda, for instance, in the Middle East. The key issue in terms of the way in which I'm framing this is that if we take as a definition, which is the one essentially that Sean mentioned earlier, that we all refer to in the book, is that we can in fact identify, as you mentioned, a number of isolated incidents that on those measures can be defined as terrorism. You are also correct to suggest that there is no real pattern or evidence to suggest that these are the result of a organisation residing outside of China, such as the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement or the TIP in Syria, for instance. So hopefully, if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that we are much more nuanced in our approach to this issue.
Thank you. Sir, in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Arnold Seidel, and I've been teaching in China. Perhaps Ms. Abbas could discuss efforts by the Chinese government to reach out to the Uyghur community abroad.
Since the situation really deteriorated in early of 2016, 2017, they have been reaching out to the Uyghurs in all over the world. The Chinese government has been reaching out to the people in the diaspora. The ones in Turkey are becoming more imminent to threats, like the two examples I give. They call them up and they ask if they can work for them, like the second example I gave. And if they refuse, there's threats about the consequences for their family members back home. And also, they make the family members call them. Like the first example I gave, Ms. Dilnur Anwar, her 7-year-old daughter texted her actually, saying that she must return within 2 days, otherwise the family will face consequences. Because she knew what happened with the returnees from Turkey and Egypt. The students were taken back, and then they disappeared. We don't have any information about their whereabouts. So she decided not to return, and then as a consequence, the kids were taken away from their grandparents. Then recently, they are reaching out to the people in US, Canada, and also in Europe, Australia, all over the world, asking them to give their IDs, personal IDs, and the car license plates, bank accounts, and also they are using family members back home as a threat. So people in diaspora, the Uyghur people, are living in very despair and stress, depression. They are reaching out to this far, actually.
Even here in the United States. Miss, in the back row.
My name is Ajna Sarawalti, and I'm an Uyghur American. And I'd like to ask a question that I think is on the minds of most Uyghurs abroad and in the homeland. I think Louisa brought it up earlier. What next? Is there any hope in sight? Do you think that we'll likely see any sort of international intervention into the situation? You painted a very bleak picture today. It seems like everything is going downhill. So I just want to know, is there any hope in sight for the Uyghur people in their homelands and those worrying about their loved ones abroad?
We've had some clarity recently from the U.S. Congress, as you know. There's been the Magnitsky Act, discussion of applying that to a number of people involved, although if you ask me, that needs to be escalated. There are clearly many people responsible for what's going on in Xinjiang, not only in Urumqi, but also in Beijing. Much greater clarity from the United States on this, I think, will possibly help other countries find their own voice on this issue. But I'm curious what our panelists think. Luisa, in particular.
Yes, I mean, there are two stages to this. One question is simply rescue. Of course, we know through very persistent international media coverage that, in fact, some Uyghurs abroad are being punished by having their passports canceled. So they become unable to maintain their visa status when they are abroad. Under such stress, feelings of hopelessness and despair, at least there's a hope that they themselves will not be caught into the maw of the machine, even when their nieces and nephews, parents, and everyone else are. So what is the obligation of other countries who have people who are on student visas and so on? Can there be a policy solution so that their visas can be extended indefinitely? At the very least, don't turn away that rescue ship at the port. That's the immediate action. And then consequences for the Chinese government to change the calculus. I've painted a picture that the Chinese government has backed itself into a corner. It now has people on its hands and doesn't have anything to do with it. But it's not too late. Absolutely reversing the policy now, perhaps with the help of other countries, would be much better than continuing it. And so consequences in terms of sanctions, in terms of high level, there are trade negotiations going on. Why isn't Xinjiang part of that conversation?
Sir.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service. Given the earlier discussion that made some comparisons with the actions in Tibet, I'm wondering, is there any comparison that can be made with the earlier Chinese policy of dealing with the Catholic Church in China, where there's an underground Catholic Church compared to the so-called official church from the Vatican?
Luisa, would you?
Yes, this dual policy applies to all religions in China. So for a long time, let's say in the post-Mao era, the idea was you can believe in religion if you belong to an approved church and you're not an official, and that was honored in the breach, but that has been tightened up under Xi Jinping. So at least for the last 6 years, it has become much more well understood and enforced that if you are a party official, which means, of course, 100 million people, you must uphold the atheist ideals of your party. And so you'll be dismissed if you practice religion. And certainly the issue is, connection to a foreign authority is exactly the point behind the cynicization of religion policy, which has been one of many things going on under Xi Jinping that has been described and observed, but it's a bewildering array of political changes and tightening up that's happening, and one of them is the cynicization of religion to supposedly remove foreign influence.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Satoshi Nishihata, Washington correspondent, Happy Science USA. My questions are a bit similar of former one, but a week ago, Marco Rubio and Christopher Smith urged the Trump administration to swiftly impose a sanction on Chinese officials regarding this issue. So I have been wondering, so what kind of role the government of the United States and other countries, including especially Japan, the democratic country in Asia, can do for the resolution. So if you have any thought, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
mean, as I mentioned earlier, the Magnitsky Act provides one instrument. A lot of what is happening in Xinjiang is being enabled by the lack of any sort of pushback from the wider, from other countries. So more leadership, particularly from Tokyo, certainly from the United States, from New Delhi would be extremely useful, I think, and appreciated. American and Japanese technology has largely enabled the police state in Xinjiang and elsewhere. There's something that the democracies of the greater Asia Pacific need to do to focus on making sure that we control and don't export these technologies to a country like the People's Republic of China going forward. I mean, there's a lot of policy work that can be done on that front, but Sean.
I feel that in many ways, the issue is serious enough, and very few countries have enough leverage over China on their own, that this really has to be something that a group of countries really push at the UN. We've seen, the question is whether there's serious leadership from some of the larger, stronger countries, whether you would see some of the Muslim countries also support at least independent investigations about what's happening in these camps, and hopefully force a closure of them. I hate to depend on the UN. It's a difficult route, but I think it's a serious enough issue that really has to be brought up to that level.
Yeah, PRC should be asked to defend its egregious behavior in the United Nations at the bare minimum. Ma'am, we have time for a final question.
Thank you. I just wonder if anyone has looked at parallels between the treatment of the Uyghurs and the treatment of Aboriginal peoples in many Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, Australia has a well-known history of this, unfortunately. And when Louisa was talking about the issue of separation of parents from children, that immediately brought down to mind. I jotted straight down the stolen generation in Australia. So this refers to a group of Indigenous Aboriginal peoples who were taken away from their family and fostered out either to various orphanages run by religious orders and so on and so forth from really the late 19th century onwards. And that's taken nearly 50 to 60 years for the Australian government to recognise that those events took place. And there was our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, issued a national apology to Indigenous people in 2008. So it's not like we don't know the effects of these kinds of policies. So again, it's cycling back to this issue of what can be done. I think Senator Rubio should be congratulated for pushing this forward and showing leadership on this. What needs to happen now, though, is friends and allies of the United States need to chime in as well. And again, my own government has been, I think, silent on this issue for far too long. Our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I know they've been working behind the scenes, but officially there's been no statement, no representation to Chinese counterparts about Australia's criticism of this. And given our record and our history of our own mistakes with Indigenous populations, we should be actually one of the first to do so.
Thank you all for coming, and I really want to thank all of our speakers today. I look forward to hosting you all again here in the future. And